There's one more German artist that I want to talk to you about, and this is Lucas Cranach the Elder. Also from a family of painters. His father was a painter. In fact, the family name originally was Mahler, which means fine art painter. His sons were painters, and one of his sons, Lucas Cranach the Younger, continues painting in the same style as his father, and continues in his office, essentially, because he remains the court painter to the Elector of Saxony. So Lucas Cranach the Elder was a court painter to a number of electors of Saxony, 3 electors of Saxony. These were the rulers of Saxony, and they were also the protectors and, for some of them, the patrons of Martin Luther. Lucas Cranach the Elder was a good friend to Martin Luther. And in fact, it seems to be Cranach who perhaps, I would say opened his eyes or educated Luther on the possibilities of art. So Luther was never an iconoclast. And at one point later on, and I always think, he must have been influenced by his friend, the painter. He says something about people who want to destroy art. He says, because they want to destroy art because art leads men astray. They might think they should worship the art. And I think that probably seemed absolutely ridiculous to Martin Luther. But he pointed out that when you're thinking about the crucifixion, a picture comes in your head of a man on the cross. So how could an image, be wrong? And then he also has this kind of interesting analogy. He says, wine and women could lead men astray, but we don't pour out all the wine and kill all the women. So why destroy the art? Lucas Cranach the Elder did create Reformation iconography. He was the illustrator of the Luther Bibles, the various editions, including very beautiful illustrations in the Ganze Biblia, the entire Bible, when that finally came out. And he was one of the people who was at Luther's wedding. So he was a very close friend of him. Now, when I'm saying that, I don't want you to think that he only did Protestant art, because the lines between Protestant and Catholic, at this point, I think the Catholics probably thought they could get rid of this heretic, Martin Luther, and Luther at one point actually thought that they would agree with him. He would point out these things that were wrong and the church would reform. And then, of course, it became apparent that there was a complete break in the Western Church. But Lucas Cranach the Elder painted religious subjects, which included things like the Madonna and Child and, art that, you might look at and say, well, that's Catholic art. He continued to do that. He continued to paint for his patrons. He painted also many portraits of aristocrats. And among other things, he painted portraits of his friend, Martin Luther, which became, he created the image of Martin Luther, if you will. And many people copied these. And they were, all over Germany. He also, as a court artist, was creating classical nudes, because that new knowledge of classical antiquity was in the northern courts as well. This is the new knowledge, if you will. And what your text has now is this picture of the Nymph of the Spring, the National Gallery in Washington, and there are some other versions of it. And the inscription in Latin translates as, "I am the nymph of the sacred spring. Do not disturb my sleep. I am resting." Now, it's a classical reference where there are personifications of, various objects in nature, of the winds or water, river gods, as we sometimes call them. So this is the nymph of the spring. And as you can see, she's a nude figure. In fact, what's, I suppose, would have been very titillating at the time was the fact that what she's resting on is a garment that's very much like garments that we see in other portraits, and portraits by Lucas Cranach, showing the court dress, that the beautiful dresses that the women would wear in Germanic courts with the slashed and poofed sleeves, which I can just see a little bit of. So it's almost like she's taken off her court dress and it's just lying out there in nature. It is certainly a reference to classical antiquity. I don't think they've been able to establish an exact source. And he painted other subjects. He painted many, many Venuses. He and his followers, his workshop, also painted many pictures of the Judgment of Paris. The best two, I think, are probably the tiny one in Karlsruhe, and well, it's not tiny, it's not huge either, but a reasonably sized one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we mentioned he was a friend of Martin Luther, so I thought I should bring this in. This is a portrait of Martin Luther, which was created from life. It's a watercolor. And you may have seen pictures of Luther, and they often seem to be based on this. So, he does something from life, and then, he turns out portraits, and people turn out copies, and they make woodcut copies, and they're engravings. Just many images of Luther. This is just, of course, one. This used to be in the textbook in earlier editions, so I thought I would show this to you also. This is Martin Luther as Junker George, or translated Squire George. And this got to be a very popular image, I guess from about 1522 on. It is Luther in disguise. He grows a beard, that's the disguise, when he's at Wartburg Castle. Okay, what happened? He went to the Diet of Worms, where he was condemned as a heretic. But they didn't just grab him and execute him, because the emperor had promised him safe passage. This is Charles V, in his youth, who had been elected the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles had said that Luther could come and go freely. They wouldn't kill him. So it was safe for him to come. So Luther was condemned, but allowed to leave. But the condemnation meant that anybody could kill him, could apprehend him, could bring him back to be executed as a heretic, and he disappeared. His followers, the people who were supporters of Luther's idea, didn't know what had happened to him. Well, nobody knew except a very few people. And it was thought that he had been killed. Well, he hadn't. Albrecht Dürer writes in his diary, "Oh Lord, if Luther is dead, who will so clearly teach us the gospel?" Well, as it turned out, Luther wasn't dead. He had been subjected to what, I guess you would call it a friendly kidnapping. He was apprehended and taken to Wartburg Castle on the orders of Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. And I said, the electors were Luther's protectors. So here he was his protector. Now, Frederick the Wise didn't break with the Catholic Church. His brother, who became the elector after him, Johann the Constant, John the Constant, or John the Steadfast, and then his successor, his son, Johann Friedrich, were staunch Lutherans. But Frederick was not having the church dictate to him what Frederick, the ruler of Saxony, could do with his professor from his university. He was asserting his right as ruler. and protected Luther. So he had him taken to Wartburg Castle, where Luther hid out and grew a beard. And I guess the idea was that, if anybody came saying, hey, we're looking for that Martin Luther guy, is he hiding here? You could say, oh, no, the person's here is Junker George. He's the only new guy around. So it worked. He was not discovered. While he was at Wartburg Castle, Luther wrote his German translation of the New Testament. And he had 2 source books, the Vulgate and Erasmus's new edition of the Greek New Testament. And he wrote a new translation. There had been some, I didn't know this when I first started doing my research. I taught a course called The Art of the Protestant Reformation, and I had to learn more about it. So I did some research, and I found out that there had been translations into German of the Bible before Luther, which I didn't know. Only they weren't very good translations. They were translations where somebody said, you almost have to know Latin to understand what they're saying. So I assumed they were translating sort of word by word. The way, if you have a web translator, it sometimes will do, and it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you understand the language and can go back and sort of figure out what the structure is. But he wrote the Bible as people would say it, as he said. So it became, extremely important for German literature as well as the history of religion. This was released in September of 1522 and is known as the September Testament. And about, at that time, Luther came out of hiding, and he was saved. Here is a portrait of Luther a bit later with Melanchthon, who is, he was his Greek teacher and his colleague. He was the Greek professor at Wittenberg, and he also translated a lot of Luther's Latin writings into German, and he wrote the Lutheran Catechism. Somebody said that he made Luther's comprehensible or something like that. But at any rate, this is a portrait by Lucas Cranach the Younger. And both of these portraits, which have been put together as you can see, as a double portrait, actually are based on portraits that his father had done of both men, and then once again, repeated over and over again. And I thought this one was interesting because, of course, I'm teaching at East Tennessee State University, and this is in the next state over. It's in the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh.